Hello. In this iteration number 5, we start with the game screen. We completed so far the help screen and the navigation. So in the game itself, there are different aspects, and we broke it down in the initial planning into 3 iterations. In the game, the user will hear a sound, and the job is to identify what that sound was. So, playing the sound or hearing the sound, that's the challenge. Every game must have a challenge, and it presents that challenge in a certain way. In our case, the challenge is to recognize the sound, and we're presenting the challenge by playing as a different sounds in a set of turns, 3 times or 4 times or 5 times. Then the user need to respond to that challenge. And in our case, the response to the challenge, according to the mockup, will be by clicking on one of the main buttons that has the notes. This is the main game screen. So the game will play the sound and they click on one of those to respond to the challenge. And then the game will evaluate that challenge and provide answer whether it's a correct answer or an incorrect answer. So every game will have a challenge, a method to present that challenge, a method to collect the response from the user, and a method to evaluate the user response. So we'll start with the challenge. The challenge is the sound, playing that sound. So the big piece of it is when the user clicks start game, we play a random sound. So that's what we're going to focus on in this iteration. Then we're going to capture the user answer and evaluate that. So the user response to the challenge and evaluating that response will be the second. And then finally calculating the score and all what comes with it, and ending the game will come after that. So we'll start. Oops. So we'll say here iteration 5. We'll have in iteration 5, this is the playing random sound. Actually, it's also starting the game. At one point in one of those iterations, we need to build the structure of the game, and we will be building that as we go. So we'll say 5.1 problem formulation. And the scope is for this particular iteration is play a random sound when the user click the start game. We'll focus on that for now. And then the testing, user clicks start game, and the app responds with a random sound or a random note. We should probably call it random note, not sound, because we're playing specifically with music notes, so we'll just say note. Then in the in the second one, the solution formulation, second step, we have the model, and the model here we're gonna it's probably same as before. We have the note file, which is an MP3 file, and we're gonna capture that in an AV audio player. And we learned about that when we were working with the help screen. Then we have all note files, which will be collection of MP3 files, and we'll use the NS array as a collection. And you may recall in project number 1, we had list of quotes, and in order to generate a random quote, we loaded those quotes in an array and found a random element of the array and grabbed that quote. So same concept can be applied here. Find the random, load the files, but we're not gonna load all the files. We'll load the URL for the file. From the work on the help screen, you may have noticed we only need the URL for the file in order to load the content in an audio player. You may decide that I'm going to create an array of audio players, but you don't need that for this particular case. We just need to create an array of the location of the file or the URL of that file. The view no change in the view. In this case, just want to try. You click on it, you hear a random note. So no change on the view from the before. And then in the controller, so the controller will process that. So the controller um, answers two important questions. What would the app do, and when would the app do it? The what is about the algorithm, the steps. The when is about the event that will trigger that action. So we said that we want the random note to be played when the user click on the start game. So this means that we need to create an action function to respond to the start game button. All right. We need to also load all the note file, the URLs of all the note files into a collection. So when should we do that? Should we load the note files every time the user click on the start game, or should that be loaded when the app loads? And mostly any situation where you have to load a large set of data for your app to deal with, you may want to do that at the beginning of your app. So we'll need also to respond to the app loading, and this is the viewDidLoad function. So in the viewDidLoad event, we need to load the URL for the different note files. So we'll load that, and then we'll create the game function. Then we'll try to be more organized. So we'll create a play random note function to process the random note. So in the solution implementation, we'll create the steps. So first step is to connect the start game button with an action function. Then we'll need to modify the viewDidLoad function to load the URLs of the different note files. And then we need to implement a play random note function to play a random note. And then finally call the play random note function from the start game. And then test, commit, and push. So let's go ahead and do that. So first we need to connect the start game button. So we need to bring in the assistant editor. And from the assistant editor, we click the start game control and add a start game action function. So that's an action. And in this case, I don't need the start game button for anything. So I'll say none. And when you say none for the argument, the type doesn't matter. And I'm going to call it a start game. So this will be a function that will be called to start and run the entire game operation. So we have the connection. That's all what we need on the view. And now we switch to the standard editor and go to the view controller.swift. So in the view controller.swift, I need to load the URL of the note files. So I need to create an array or a collection. You may have learned from project number 1 that where you create the collection or a variable is important. The rule of thumb is the scope of any variable is the block in which you create it. Creating the variable is when you use the let or the var keywords. That's when it is actually created in memory. So you want to create it within the scope in which you're going to use it. So the array will be used here, and it also will be used in the play random node. So we need the larger scope. So for the array, we will create it in the larger scope of the entire class. So we come here and say var, and I'm gonna call it notes, and this will be an ns array, and I will not initialize that ns array. All right. So to load the URL of the different notes file, we've done that in project 1. We did it with the help screen. We first need to get a reference to the app bundle. So we'll say bundle.main. And notice here that I used let within the block of the viewDidLoad function. This means that app bundle will only be accessible or visible within the block of the viewDidLoad function. So compare that to the notes, which is accessible in the block of the class. So it will be available anywhere inside that class. So once I got the bundle, I can then load the array. So I will say that notes equal, and then you have URLs, app bundle dot URL. So you have URL or URLs, which returns back a reference array, and that we can load into our NS array. So it asks you for the extension and asks you for the subdirectory if there was a subdirectory. And we don't have a subdirectory here, so we'll just use nil for it. So the extension is MB3, so I'm saying load all the files with the MB3 extension that exist in the main directory, so we'll use nil here for that directory. If you had a directory inside your project, you can use that directory here. So it's given us an issue because we need to convert from the URL type to the NS array type. So we'll say here convert to NS array. So now that we loaded the URL of all the nodes, we can implement the play random sound. So I'll create. You could create in the past when we connect an action function, we write our code inside the action function, and we can do that here. But because the game is very involved and have multiple states, I don't want to play the sound inside the start game, because there will be a lot of actions, as you will see, that need to take place inside the start game. You could, if you don't know, well, I know that because I went through this before, but in your case, if you're doing this as a new project, you can go ahead and implement it right inside the start game. And as the iterations evolve, it will make it clear for you that you need to do some reorganization. You can then move things around. I didn't want to do that so that you don't get confused. So I'm going to create a function that only does playing random note. So I will say play random note, and I don't need any parameters for that function, and the function does not return any data to whoever calls that function. So what should happen in that function, like you've done before, is step 1, we need to get a random index between 0 and the number of files. So I will say let random index equal, and then the to create a random file we use the arc for random, and the arc for random will return an unsigned or random. There is also random, and I think we use the arc for random. Yeah, that's a good one. And then we will say we want to get random number between 0 and the count of the node files. But the arc for random the count is an integer, an arg for random is not an integer, so we put an int in here.